Okay, I think
Hi.
this means we are. Oh, there's some. Okay, we go. Hi, everyone. Sorry about.
Hello.
Um, so, uh, hello. Thank you for joining us for Bookbound 2020 on this very exciting Saturday night. This is a From Home Literary Festival. My name is Octavia Bright, and I'm here to host this discussion between authors Niven Govinden and Paul Mendez. This event has been curated in partnership with Wasafiri magazine to raise money for the UK-based mental health charity Mind. Mind provides advice and support to empower people experiencing mental health problems. Their statistics show that on average, 1 in 4 people will experience a mental health problem in a typical year. And 2020 is obviously really not a typical year, so a very good time to be supporting this charity. Please make your donation to support Mind using the link to BookBound Just Giving page displayed below. We're really close to meeting our target. In fact, I think we have met our target, but we're over it, so please keep giving. You can find out more about BookBound, Wasafiri, Mind, and our authors by visiting our website, bookbound2020.co.uk. But now for the event. So it's an absolute pleasure to introduce Niven and Paul. Niven Govinden is the author of 5 novels, including Black Bread, White Beer, which won the Fiction Uncovered Prize, and All the Days and Nights, which was longlisted for the Folio Prize and shortlisted for the Green Carnation Prize. His latest book, This Brutal House, published by Dialogue Books, has been shortlisted for the 2019 Gordon Byrne Prize and the 2020 Jalak Prize. Paul Mendez grew up in the Black Country and now lives and works in London, where he studies an MA in Black British writing at Goldsmiths. Rainbow Milk is his first novel. So we're going to crack on with this chat, but you can ask Niven and Paul questions as we go. So if you type them into the comments, we'll get to those at the end. And please ask away. The guys would love to talk to you.
Yeah, let's talk. Please ask us stuff.
So I'm going to start by asking you both to just introduce your books, because they're so different from one another, and yet there's a lot that they're speaking in the same space. And I think for us to really get into it, it would be great to give the audience a bit of a kind of grounding in the narrative. So Niven, let's start with you. Can you introduce
Okay.
Brutal House?
So this is This Brutal House, and it's a novel set in New York against the backdrop of the voguing/ball community there. And I suppose in a nutshell, it's essentially the story of a protest started by the mothers of the legendary voguing houses in New York, who basically one day decide to start a silent protest on the steps of City Hall with the children from their voguing houses. And what they're protesting about is the disappearances of kids from their voguing houses over the years through homophobic, transphobic violence, structural inequality, poverty, all that stuff. And the city never really doing anything about it. And they've tried through various means over the years, through political lobbying, through protesting, through rioting, and nothing's ever really worked. And they decide one day that actually just to sit on the steps of City Hall en masse, silently, in an act of protest over several days is going to get them what they want. And the novel basically follows the story of this protest from its origins to the sort of microcosm of it as it sort of reaches a conclusion. And what I was trying to do with the book is really that I wanted to write a novel of queer protest, queer POC protest, and really to look at a community. And also it's written, half of the novel is written, narrated by the mothers, and I use we, so it's a collective voice, so they're not named. And what I'm trying to do is write a fictional oral history and sort of give record to a community's collective trauma, resilience, determination to find answers and to stand up for their community.
Yeah, that I want to get into this in more detail in a minute, but that plural voice is so powerful, and so, like, I don't know, it seems so vital to what you're exploring, and the fact that kind of queer communities have to build their own families in order to find
for sure
friends, you know, which is also something that comes up a bit in Rainbow Milk, but in quite a different way. So Paul, could you introduce your novel, please?
Yeah, I just want to pick up on your point there, Niven, on a fictional oral history.
because Rainbow Milk is written from 2 points of view. The first is, it comprises the first sort of 50 pages of the novel, and is in the first person dialectical voice of Norman Alonso, who's a Jamaican immigrant to Great Britain, who settles in the Black Country in 1959. He's speaking anyway. He moved in 1956 with his wife, who was pregnant at the time. And sort of by the time we are speaking to him in July 1959, he's the father of 2 children. He's suffering from terrible migraine headaches and is going blind. And he's at home when he should be at work. He's at home looking after his 2 children. His wife is out working. And he sort of creates the world of the Black Country in those days, of, post Notting Hill riots, of, neo-fascism, the days of Oswald Mosley and his rhetoric, the days of KBW, Keep Britain White, being sprayed onto Black people's houses. And he is a tall, big man, a former boxer, who is left feeling extremely vulnerable. So he, in some ways, is based on my grandfather, my paternal grandfather, of whom I knew very, very, very little. And I just sort of used these tiny little scraps of information that I had about him and created a narrative around him as a means of, as you say, Niven, sort of reclaiming a history for these people, because, the Windrush generation, as we know them, are dying. The Windrush first docked in 1948, which is over 70 years ago now. So it's very, very important that this generation and future generations really sort of keep that voice alive, because of what we've seen happening socially with them over the last 3 years, particularly. So I started with that point of view and then moved on to a character called Jesse, who we meet at the age of 19 in 2002, who is from a Jehovah's Witness sort of mixed race family. He's Black, but his mother married a white man when he was 2 years old, and they raised him as a Jehovah's Witness. And he finds himself as a teenager very much conflicted between his faith and his responsibility to his congregation, and his burgeoning sense of responsibility to himself to sort of live his own truth. And so we find him in London, working as a sex worker, having left his family and his religion behind. And we sort of watch him grow, and it sort of becomes a coming of age story from there. And then eventually we see how the 2 points of view resolve.
Yeah, so it's a novel that spans a lot of voices and a lot of different experiences, right? Like I feel like Rainbow Milk it's a very full population, right? Of the people that Jesse encounters, and tracing that link between, you end up in 2016, don't you? So it's a really powerfully drawn link between the Windrush, kind of the arrival of the Windrush generation, and then contemporary young Black queer experience, I suppose.
Yeah.
I mean, both of you have written novels that are, I think of them as documents of very sort of fundamental queer history. And as you said, Niven, POC queer history, like race is totally vital to both of the stories that you're telling. And I think when it comes to ball culture, like, I don't know, my first encounter with it was through the documentary Paris is Burning, like a lot of people. And obviously since then there's been the TV show Pose, and there's that thing, I don't know what it is, the reality thing with Jamila Jamil that was controversial.
Yeah, which is coming out later this year, I think. Are they filming it? And they're filming it now, aren't they? Which sounds amazing. I know people were moaning about it, but they've got some really cool creative people from the current ball scene now. So it feels totally authentic, and I don't think people should judge it until we actually see what it is. I'm really excited to see it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Agreed.
But that's a culture that definitely from watching the movies is so kind of visual and physical. It's all about dance and costume and everything. So, how did you feel about putting it down in words? It must have been quite a challenging thing to approach, to think, I'm going to encapsulate it on the page.
Well, yes and no, in the sense that I'd been thinking about writing a novel that was something to do with ball culture for maybe like over a decade. I think in the early noughties, I wrote a short story between novels that was for a tiny little magazine in Italy, and it was about the sort of twilight era of the voguing houses before everything really imploded, and sort of that scene that really shone brightly in the sort of global consciousness and within queer consciousness, for about 5 years or so, and then it went back underground. And I wrote a story about a mother from one of those great houses sort of lamenting the fall. She was living that kind of fall. And before it was published, I remember an editor of a magazine saying to me, "Are you writing a novel about balls? Because I would really read it." And it was sort of like a little light bulb moment. And I just sort of tucked it away and was working on other novels. And then when I finished my fourth novel, which was a book about portrait painting, I just felt, actually, I really want to write a book about balls now. But what I didn't want to do was write a primer about voguing, because, Paris is Burning really, for me, still is the most perfect piece of art that's been made about that scene. And I wanted to write something that felt totally immersive and wasn't it just wasn't a primer for non-queer people to what that scene was, So it was, and also when I realised that, I knew, sort of running parallel, that I wanted to write a novel that was based on a collective voice, that I really wanted to explore the idea of writing an unwritten social history of, a group of people. So it just came from, it was just very, I can't really explain, it was just very natural, and it came from there. And it was really about, once I had the mother's voice, I kind of knew where I was going. I just sort of ran with it. And the other thing I didn't want to do at all was write about, it's a novel set within voguing, but I don't want to write about voguing. Does that make sense? So I wasn't going to write chapters where they go to a Vogue ball and adventures happen. That just isn't what I'm interested in at all. I'm interested in the integrity of those people within their environment, but outside of the environment. So they've created the Vogue balls, but they're living with it. It's a novel about a city and the benevolence of the city, and the city as a parent, and what the city gives or doesn't give you, and the rights of, what a city should be giving the people who live within it. So it comes from all those things. And as I was writing it, I knew very quickly, as the mother's voice came on, that it was going to be a novel of voices. So being able to use different voices. So there's a character called Teddy, who's one of the found children, who ends up becoming the mother's protector, the Vogue caller. And I use the Vogue caller really, because I love the wordplay of a Vogue caller in Vogue balls, because I love the energy of it. I love the wordplay. There's a big correlation to a Vogue caller and how MCs work in hip hop. So I love all those things, and it really gives you what the power of what voguing is. But it's used in the actual Vogue caller chapters are used in quite a political way to actually reinforcing, queer power, basically. And I've just had I'm really fascinated by the reactions when I get from readers when they read those chapters in particular. So the one chapter is called Vogue Caller 1, which is category is, which is a Vogue caller calling out ball categories. And some are very obvious, first time in drags, femme-real, all that stuff. And then it just becomes more political as it goes on, and you really feel the power of actually what walking in those categories means as a queer person of colour within that setup. I find that really powerful. And some people love that, and some people are really perplexed by that. And then the other chapter of the Vogue caller is just several pages with the Vogue caller telling people to walk the balls, which again, it's a very powerful thing. And I think you either get it or you don't. And it kind of perplexed a lot of people. But it's the truth of what the culture of what that culture is, and what it kind of meant to me. So it was I didn't feel that I was held back by doing it. I just really kind of threw myself into it. I just wanted to do it, in the best way that I knew, that felt sort of true to me, I guess.
I think that's what's so powerful about it, though, because like you said, you're not setting out to write a primer for a curious straight person who wants to know more about it. You're throwing your reader into the mix and just being like, well, it's sink or swim, buddy. It's kind of up to you.
And also it's challenging. And I think of this a lot when I write, especially the more I write books, is about challenging the notion. And this only really comes from when you look outside of yourself and you go to literary festivals and talk about your books with other people, which is, as a writer of colour, you're constantly being told that your book is other and your point of view is other. And the whole point of writing books where you're drawing three-dimensional characters is in your own narrative, you're not other. You're the most central person in your own narrative. So when you write a story with that amount of conviction without a primer, it can unsettle people because they're like, well, normally if I read a book like this, there would be someone to hold my hand and explain to me what's going on, and that's not really my job.
Yeah.
You know, a lot of what you bring to a book as a reader, I've learned a lot from just getting, you know, publishing books and seeing how people respond to books, is you bring your own baggage as a reader to every novel you write, every novel you read, and it's a summation of, you know, your life history, your expectations, where you come, you know, everything. The accumulation of your life experience comes when, you know, is present when you read a book. So what is the lack is to do with, you know, to do with all those things, and that's not up to me.
No, God no. Well, also the thing I found with the Vogue caller sections, it reminds me something that the poet and novelist Ocean Vuong said when I interviewed him a while ago for the podcast I do, where he spoke about what he basically wanted to ask the question of his own writing: what would happen if your novel collapsed on itself? And we were talking about kind of prose descending into poetry as becoming a kind of breakdown in form that is unforgiving of the reader and kind of queer in itself, because it rejects the traditional formalism of the novel in a way that's really exciting. And I found that reading This Brutal House very much. But then, Paul, you know, your novel is in a completely different universe in that it's much more realist. And I know that, you know, as you were saying, your kind of main protagonist, Jessie, is raised as a Jehovah's Witness, which I know that you were also, and that there's a map between your experience and Jessie's experience that overlaps quite a lot, and then not in other places. And I was struck by this line: if he had a computer, Jessie thought, and wasn't a Jehovah's Witness, he would write a book about his childhood. Jehovah's Witnesses don't write books, which, when you know your own personal history, really, really stands out. And later you have a line where you say that Jessie realizes he could write to make sense of everything that had happened to him. So I wanted to ask you, you know, did you find the same in writing this book?
Yes, very much so. And Rainbow Milk came about from years and years of using my laptop as a shrink. And just sort of writing about myself and how I felt, and just sort of to keep tabs on myself. I guess the period that I wanted to write about most, and that was the reason for the book in the first place, was to chart my life and the decisions I'd made and the sort of situations I've been put in, between being a devout baptized Jehovah's Witness at 17 with a very sort of set future, to become an elder, to marry, to have children, to do all of that. And then finding myself at the age of 22 in London, away from family, at Christmas, having gone through sexual assault, and not having any idea of what my future was supposed to be. So it was at that point that I very much realized that writing was the only way that I was going to ever explain that, just to sort of cut things up into sort of small little thoughts that would help me to almost create a future for myself. Because, you know, once you lose your center of gravity, being religion, you have nothing. So I just had to sort of take refuge in writing. And as things progressed over the years, I was able to eventually find the distance. And it was really Charmaine Lovegrove who challenged me to write a novel, because that's the ultimate sort of distance, really, is to write fiction. Because, you know, it's one thing trying to remember everything that happened 15 years ago and remember who you were and think the thoughts of a 19, 20, 21-year-old. But it's quite another to step away from it, to write in third person and to actually create characters and create interior spaces and create maybe have everything that happened to me happen to him, but just with different people, different voices, different dialogue, different clothes, different music, etc., etc. So it became a creative challenge, and one that's very much rooted in realist aesthetics, but one that I could also use to explain things to myself and to hopefully pass on a story that others can benefit from.
The theme of art taking the place of religion is something that comes through in the book really strongly. And there's a lovely scene where one of your characters, where Jesse ends up going to the Tate Modern when he's missing his, what is it called? The
Kingdom Hall.
Kingdom Hall, thank you, sorry. Yeah, when he's missing the Kingdom Hall. And I was thinking about how, yeah, the space the book occupied for you as the writer perhaps fulfilled a similar role. I don't know if it was necessarily as direct as that, but like, do you believe that art can replace faith in a way that's less judgmental, maybe less kind of exclusionary?
Yeah, definitely. Because it's on your terms and you're in control. And you go whenever you want to. It's not that you have to be at the Kingdom Hall on a Thursday at 7 o'clock anymore, or on Sunday morning at 10 o'clock. You don't have to go out knocking doors anymore. But what you can do is you can get to your laptop and just be in control of your own space, be in control of your own environment, and try to figure things out for yourself, rather than continue to be sort of continue to subscribe to this sort of doctrine that sort of came before you and that your parents sort of brought you up in, that you had no real sort of say in whatsoever. It is about choice, I think, writing and engaging with art. Because art, I suppose, is sort of man's way of figuring out who he is and what his sort of power is and what his sort of visions are, that are nothing to do with God. I'm sorry if there are any sort of evangelical Christians out there watching who might disagree with me, but I do think that it is within all of our power to sort of engage creatively, to think about who we are and what our place is in the world, and basically, I don't know, maybe even sort of try to create a path for ourselves to follow that doesn't necessarily end up with Armageddon and with, 95% of the people on the planet dying just because they don't worship Jehovah, which is the thing that I couldn't get my head around, because there were just so many nice people out there who I met after I left the Witnesses. And I thought, what? All these people are supposed to be dying at Armageddon, and they're just really nice people, and they just helped me with something. And, in fact, I saw more love outside the organization once I'd left than I'd seen within. So I was just very messed up about the idea of Armageddon and the apocalypse, and I needed to do something to sort of take myself away from all of that. But then actually being in a physical space is what I missed, I suppose, when I did move to London, was out of the organization. So going to the Tate Modern, that was my sanctuary. I loved to just go and sit in the Rothko room and contemplate. I was absolutely devastated when, I love Agnes Martin, but do you remember for a couple of years, it was the Agnes Martin room. I was so devastated because it just wasn't the same. It was like all white and like, beautiful sort of pastels and candy colors. I was like, no, I need the dark. I need the intense reds. I need to sort of like throw myself into this bloody canvas and sort of scream and listen to Joy Division. But
those passages were really powerful.
Thank you.
Yeah, they really were. And it got me thinking, even just listening to you now, partly what you're talking about is also the ritual, right? Like the ritual spaces that faith offers, or religious spaces offer, when you are no longer welcome in those spaces for whatever reason that might be. You need to find alternative ones. And I think that's something that comes through in your book, Niven, a lot as well, because there's a strand to your narrative that's also exploring the complexity of holding faith and queerness alongside one another, because the major
very much so.
Don't welcome queerness in their spaces, but at the same time, when you have a practice of faith, how do you cope with the kind of the loss of it, and the way that the mothers relate to that is, again, it's incredibly powerful. But I was thinking about this with both of your books, that like, how do queer artists, and I mean queer people in general, but like the role of art by queer people can kind of occupy a sort of space of almost faith for the community. I don't know if that makes sense to you. I haven't explained that very clearly, but you know, offering places, even if it's just the space of ideas for communion, for people to come together.
Yeah, I mean, I think when I think to how I grew up and discovered queer culture, that was a sanctuary. You know, jumping from one book to another, to, you know, from discovering James Baldwin as a kid to Hubert Selby Jr., reading, you know, Pat Califia, Kathy Acker, Dennis Cooper, Alan Hollinghurst, Adam Miles Jones, literally, you know, jumping from one writer to one writer, but feeling the sanctuary of books, and actually discovering the space that queer culture occupies, not only within queer culture, but the wider queer culture through books and through films and through art. That's really powerful when you're trying to work out who you are and where your people are and what you can contribute and how you can be part of that culture.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that James Baldwin actually features in Rainbow Milk. Jessie reads James Baldwin, and it's quite a sort of important moment for him, encountering those texts, right? And I wanted to ask you both, actually, but Niven, you sort of just answered this question. But Paul, was Baldwin very important for you when you were, discovering who you were and finding queer literature?
I mean, I didn't really know who James Baldwin was properly until I was a bit older, sort of maybe even, I mean, I'm 30, almost 38 now, but maybe when I was 30, that was the first time I'd read Giovanni's Room in reality. The first Baldwin novel I read was Tell Me How Long the Train's Been Gone.
I love that
20.
book. I think that's my favourite. That's
really?
really my favourite. I really, really love that book.
I haven't read it since. I've got it on the shelf. I really need to read it over the next...
I reread it a few years ago. It's
really?
Still phenomenal. It's very theatrical. It's a real actor's kind of novel.
Well, it got terrible reviews at the time. I saw Mario Puzo wrote a review of it in the New York Times contemporaneously and just sort of trashed it completely.
They all trashed him after this was the first one after Another Country, and he really got a kicking for it. But I've got a really soft spot for it. I mean, it's very overblown, and it's like the third album after a massive successful. You really feel it because he talks about him traveling through, being a black man traveling through Europe, and being famous, and you really feel that he put himself into that, into those characters. But yeah, I really love that book.
Yeah, I loved it as well, for all I remember of it. But what stuck in my mind and what sort of influenced me at the time, it was just before I came out, actually. I was 20, I was living in Kent, in a house share with other students. And it was the first book I read in which there was a gay black character, or a bisexual black character. And he had an affair with this Black Panther sort of figure, or a sort of black radical. Anyway, and to me it was just a massive revelation, because I'd never seen any images or heard at all, like growing up sort of very sheltered Jehovah's Witness in the Black country, I'd never ever thought that two black men could be in a relationship. I mean, it just sounds silly, but like, if you don't see it, you don't know, especially when you're that age, and when you're, growing up in a religion where any sort of non-heterosexual, heteronormative activity is completely anathema. So it had a real sort of impact on me. But I'd also like to sort of like pair him with Steve McQueen, who we were also mentioning a little bit, because in Rainbow Milk, I've sort of had Jessie sort of see Bear, the film Bear, at the Tate Modern, which it actually was on display during that time in the permanent collection. But I first saw that at the Centre Pompidou in Paris. And again, this was in 2007. And again, I'd just never sort of seen this kind of beauty on a screen that was comprised of two black men anyway, engaged in physical contact, naked, all of
The
that.
old
Like I just never
wrestling.
exactly I've
Yeah,
never seen that
it's
before, and like
amazing.
really beautifully shot, and like blue light sort of bouncing off their beautiful black skin. Like I just never seen anything like that before.
It was
So
amazing.
I've always had this, and this is where this sort of some of the intersectionality, I suppose, in Jesse's story and character comes in, because not only does he have pressure to conform to black masculine almost stereotypes, there's also the idea of him being gay, and I would use the word gay even at that time in the sort of mid 2000s more than queer, because Jesse just doesn't come from that world, and he sort of walks into this sort of, you know, mainstream, berry, white, mask for mask culture where he's very popular because he's this skinny kid who's well hung, you know, and is a top. So you have the intersectionality there, and that's something that really sort of comes from, yeah, my own story.
I think that's what's so important to read as well, because that, you know, the idea that there is this is the difficult thing about kind of queer culture being grouped together, because it suggests a homogeneity of experience, which is of
Exactly.
course completely nonsense.
Yeah.
There's so
sorry.
many subsections to any identity under any umbrella.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And actually, and also what you want to see is the plurality, even within the subsections.
Exactly.
You know, when I was writing This Brutal House, no one was writing a novel about voguing, and I was really, I was just really in the midst of it, and I had no idea what kind of climate the book would come out in. And then as my book came out, someone wrote a novel about voguing the year before. Joseph Cassara's book, House of Impossible Beauties, which is amazing. It's really beautiful, and it's a different take on voguing. It's far closer to Pose in terms of the sort of narrative of someone who comes into a voguing house, finds themselves, finds the community. It's a different kind of book, and I could see from within the Grace culture, in terms of book culture, people were a bit perplexed. There was 2 books. It was sort of like, well, isn't one voguing book enough? And it's like, actually, there should be 10 books about voguing. It's
exactly.
really, I want a plurality of ideas and point of view and discourse and all that kind of stuff.
Well, this is the thing I think about any supposed, like I'm using air quotes because it's complex, but like minority experience in the culture is that it can interfere with a text just being a text, right? Where it gets pigeonholed. And it's actually, we've had a couple of questions come through, and this relates really well to one of them. Some YouTube watcher, Alex, hello Alex, thanks for asking a question, has asked, he says he's curious to know if you feel you're marketed as gay authors and how that feels. And did you imagine that would happen when you started writing?
Do I feel marketed as a gay author? I suppose I do, yeah. And I'm fine with that, actually. Because, I mean, I've written a book that just isn't really sort of seen everywhere, that is one of these sort of, as you say, Niven, it's one of the it's a plurality book. Like it's, there are other gay novelists, Black gay novelists, but I'm writing about sex work and religion and all of those things, and other people are writing about other things, and we all have our different spaces, as we should. Andrew Levy said, if there are 500,000 Black people, then there are 500,000 different ways of being Black. And I would say exactly the same about being queer. And so there are a multiplicity of stories, of experiences that are valid. And if it's beautiful writing, then it belongs.
And Niven, what about you? How do you feel about that categorization?
Well, I mean, I'm not massively fussed either way. To be honest, I think from a book point of view, my overwhelming feeling always has been that I'm marketed as a writer of colour first and foremost, and I don't know how I feel about that, particularly within a wider kind of book sense. I think as much as as much as it can be enriching, it's also quite limiting. So, you know, and, you know, I've written, you know, this is my 5th book, and every book I write is completely different. And some books feel, I suppose, more queer than others, if that makes sense. So how my publishers go about, you know, pushing the book and the person who wrote the book varies from book to book, I guess. But the overriding sense always has been, not that I'm a novelist of colour.
Yeah, it's tricky. It's really tricky, especially because, you know, the publishing industry, as everyone involved with it knows, is still overwhelmingly white and still overwhelmingly middle class in a way that is, you know, problematic as hell. And you know, let's quickly, there's one more question I want to ask you from YouTube, but before we do, you're both published by Dialogue Books, which is an imprint that is doing a lot to change all of that, basically.
Yeah, very much so.
Which is absolutely bloody brilliant. And I guess, you know, I wanted to ask you how you feel about being part of that movement, by being in the same publishing house, and by that being a very clear kind of setting out, like even down to the point that at the back of your books you have a list of all the people involved in publishing them. It's just completely like takes a grenade to the idea that a book is produced by a single mind in a room, you know, which is again so important, because these things are so much more collaborative than the old establishment wants anyone to believe, I think, half of the time. But yeah, here's a moment to just give a big plug to Dialogue. You guys want to say anything?
That's not difficult.
Yeah.
Shall I go?
Yeah, you
go. It can be a very, very, very scary thing. Trying to find an agent, trying to find an editor, publisher, bringing out a book, all of that can be extremely scary. But my experience with Charmaine and the team at Dialogue Books has just been positive, positive, positive at every step. Just sort of being looked after, being told that my publisher and my editor has confidence in me, even when I delivered a manuscript 5 months late, and then retracted it 3 days later and said, I'm really sorry, but I have to write the whole thing in 3rd person. Bye. And then so having to delay the book, like I just, at no point did I feel like I was under any pressure to do anything other than the work that I needed to do, and that I 100% had the support of my publisher and my team behind me. And that has continued all the way through to today. And I just have every confidence in them. And just being like one of the authors at Dialogue Books, you know, we meet up a lot, don't we, Niven? Like we have like drinks, we have dinners, like we support each other. I just don't know of another imprint like us.
No, for sure.
Where we are really sort of a team and we support each other and we're constantly growing. Charmaine's finding so many brilliant authors all the time. And I just don't know of another imprint at the moment that's just being as disruptive as we are and putting so many amazing voices that 5 years ago just wouldn't have got this gig.
Yeah, it's like listening to you, it's like the flip from a scarcity mindset to an abundance mindset, right?
Yeah,
exactly.
I mean, and what I found very interesting is the when you publish, especially when you publish for the first time, it takes you a really long time to not only find a community of writers but feel part of the community of writers. And you know, I've been published by several different houses, and you know, with my first book, literally it came out and I felt no connection to the publishing world in a lot of ways. You know, I was on the circuit and I did stuff, but I didn't feel part of a community of writers within my own publisher, within, you know, meeting other writers. I felt really, really removed. It was weird. It made no difference that the book was out. It didn't really change how I felt of myself as a writer within the community, because I didn't find my people. It wasn't until my second book, and also, you know, I'm very old, so it was pre-social media. And then by the time my second book dropped, there was MySpace, and I started doing a lot more events, and I started finding a community of writers. And so when I see what Charmaine has done and the whole team have done at Dialogue, not only building up a great, really varied, interesting, challenging list, but actually fostering a sense of community of writers who are, a great deal of our first-time writers. It's really powerful because I know what it was like to publish without that. And I think actually having a community that you can fall back on, who you can support, who will support you in return, is really, really, it's immeasurable.
And just having someone to work with who is just incredibly innovative and focused and coming up with new ideas. Like, my book got published on the 23rd of April, right in the middle of this pandemic. None of us knew that was going to happen. I was supposed to have a physical book launch. But when that sort of went out of the window, like within days, they'd come up with this whole new, like, okay, so we're going to have like a Dialogue Books Lounge, and we're going to sort of go on Instagram Live and have chats with different authors every week, and you're going to be part of it, and that's going to work, and it's going to be fine. And so I'm sort of logging in to watch other authors like yours, Niven, and I'm seeing other publishers like Fourth Estate and, other publishers sort of logging in to watch us. And it just goes to show that, the innovation really sort of spreads a positive message around that, it doesn't matter. And initiatives like this as well, like what we're doing here for Minding with Wasafiri magazine, it just sort of keeps people in the conversation despite everything that's happening in the world. So it just does give you a lot of confidence when you know that your publisher's really thinking about how to go forwards.
Yeah, I bet. Also, for a career that can be in the creative process as solitary as a writer needs to be at times, having that community is so important. And it seems sad that other people aren't as on it, right? That other publishing houses aren't necessarily doing it in the same way.
But also, I think writers by nature are quite competitive. So you do see people. You do get a sense of some writers just don't want to mix and don't want to really kind of be part of a community. I think the digital space has definitely changed all that, because you have access, so you are able to, befriend writers that you like and build up relationships. So I think it's less than it was, when I was first publishing in the early noughties, where it was still very much an old school kind of mindset where publishers really like writers to kind of stay in their box. They would bring you out when they wanted to bring you out, which is fine. But then what it does is it just cuts you off from people. I thought I'd be published and I would be meeting loads of people, and I didn't really, not till my second book.
Well, I'm glad it's changing.
Yeah, you feel the change.
Yeah, that's good. That's really encouraging. I mean, when you think about what the experiences of like young queer writers are going to be in, say, 10 years, and they'll probably be very different from yours at the beginning, at least, Niven, and maybe from you, Paul. Like, we'll see, time will tell. I've got a couple more questions from people watching, and so I think we've gone 45 minutes. I think we can go another 10 minutes.
Wow.
Maybe? I don't know.
That flew by quickly.
It's Saturday night. We got to give the people something to entertain them. So a question, there's no name on this one, but a question asks, are there any authors you would like to do an event with that festival organisers wouldn't put you with because of the homogenizing of the queer experience?
That's a good question. I'm not sure.
One to answer.
I mean, there's tons. I think when you go behind the curtain a bit for festivals, a lot of it is how festivals are programmed is very much in terms of what is the easy fix. So people don't really have a time, and also because everything's done so far in advance, people don't know your work. They don't really think beyond what the selling point is. And 9 times out of 10 for a writer of colour, you'll always be at events with other writers of colour, because it's just a very easy sell, and it's just, job done, there you go, here's some new writers of colour. And, I might have written about an orange, and Paul might have written about a melon, and we've got nothing in common, but we've got to find something in common with each other for an hour. And sometimes it can be illuminating, and sometimes it can be a massive waste of time, let's face it. You know, I wrote the book before this one was a book about art, and I would have absolutely loved to have done festivals and talked with any writer who writes about art, anyone from, you know, Olivia Laing, Amy Sackville, tons of people. No one asked, no one, you know, suggested those things. It was easier just to put me with a group of, you know, other writers of colour. So
that must be so frustrating. That must be really frustrating.
It's the reality of publishing. It's the reality of publishing books.
Yeah.
You know, I think, you know, but then the upshot is you take control and you do events that you want to do. So, you know, I'm very kind of sort of hands-on with how my books are promoted, and I'm always thinking about the events that I want to do and making the most of writers that I know and pushing my book into those kind of areas. Because if you literally wait for, you know, an arts council or a regional festival person, a harassed regional festival person who's got to fill up 50 slots to spend the time to actually curate something, you'll be waiting a really long time. So you have to do it yourself. And again, that is the history of queer art. You know, the only way queer art moved forward from, you know, protests or everything else was people had to do it themselves. So that's the lesson.
So we're waiting for your festival now, Niven.
I would love to do a festival. Absolutely love to do a festival. Someone wants to give us some money, we'll do it.
Yeah, my vote. That would be amazing.
Yeah.
And then there's a question from Saskia here, which I think, Niven, you touched on, but we can go back to it. She says, a lot of people may not know about the subjects you've discussed, voguing, etc. To what extent do you feel your books are educational? And I guess also for Paul, like that would apply to the Jehovah's Witness experience, which is, you know, one that's quite rarefied and probably something a lot of your readers don't have firsthand experience of.
Definitely. A lot of people only know about Jehovah's Witnesses in terms of, you know, maybe they know about not celebrating Christmas or birthdays. Maybe they, you know, some people might know about the blood issue where witnesses are not allowed to ingest any blood. If they're, you know, dying, leaking out in the road, they're not allowed to have a blood transfusion. They will have to die. Beyond that, the knowledge is very sort of minimal. So it is interesting. And I didn't, like you, Niven, I didn't want to sort of write the sort of remedial Jehovah's Witness novel because I don't really remember what it's like to be a Jehovah's Witness anymore. Yay! But yeah, I just didn't think it would be of interest. I needed to pick something from Jess's life that was relevant to him telling the whole story as part of Rainbow Milk. But also you look at sex work, that's also something that's not a particularly well-known subject, especially coming from a Black working class male's perspective, especially in the gay community. Unless you're really familiar with certain very sort of like recherche corners of Pornhub, you're not aware of, you know, the image of a young Black man fucking an older white man. It's just not around, like you just don't see it. So there are a lot of ways in which Rainbow Milk is sort of quite a new thing for people to digest. But let's just hope that it's the first of many such novels where we're just really surprised at the sort of the individuality of people and storytellers.
I think that also comes through so much in your book because, well, you know, sex is an experience that is like at once something that most human beings experience in a similar way and something that is completely different for everyone. And you know, when writers are approaching sex, they have that kind of burden of representation on them, right? Like, how do you write orgasmic pleasure? How do you write sexual shame? How do you write these things, right, that are so personal and yet so kind of unifying also in all of these different ways? And I think it's what I enjoyed in the sex scenes in Rainbow Milk is that they're very specific to this, as you say, very specific experience of being like a well-hung young Black sex worker, which is not something I have experience of. At the same time, because you write them sensitively and beautifully, there's a point of connection for any human being who's ever had sex, even just with themselves. You know what I mean? Like that's...
I mean, we're tapping into Jesse's, we're basically the camera on Jesse's shoulder. you know, it's third person, it's written in third person, but we are really inside his head pretty much. And he, obviously having been raised in this very sheltered environment, is now suddenly free. He's not even in the same city as his family or anybody who knows him. So he is absolutely free to go out there and go into Compton's on a Monday afternoon and pick up a guy and fuck him in the toilets, you know, and that's his experience, and that's great. And we're sort of seeing that with him because he's experiencing it for the first time. So it's not, you know, we don't know that, we don't have the scaffold for that in our brains. Like, we've just never seen that before. So we just have to sort of say it as it is, rather than, you know, we're not writing sonnets about it. Like, it's you know, it's Megan Thee Stallion saying, you know, I'm rich but I'm ratchet. Like, it's it's really sort of like, it's out there, it's plain language. It's like, my dick went inside him. That's it. That's all you can really say. Once we do have the scaffold and we have the sort of bank of images in our minds, so that we don't necessarily have to think of sex as being an act, that, you know, if you are a straight white male writer and you're writing a sex scene, you can just go off in any kind of direction because people already know what it's going to look like. But if
So
it's
that
just
often ends up in some very bad places. Come on, let's be real. Like,
most of the time.
Straight white men writing sex, not my favorite.
And I didn't want to write. I didn't want to win the bad sex award.
No.
So, like, I just thought, you know, if I just make this as plain as possible, then, like, no one can accuse me of being weird.
Yeah. No, not me. I guess I think we probably need to wrap up in about 5 minutes. I feel like we could go on for forever. It's been such a pleasure to talk to you guys. I guess my last question for both of you is, how do you feel about your books having a position in a kind of queer canon, or a canon of queer experience, of the kind of literature that, you know, you guys both experience and that works its way into your books? Niven, let's start with you.
I welcome it. Yeah, put it in there. Put it on a pedestal. Light it well. Yeah, I mean, you know, being a queer writer of colour, that in itself is a political act. Finishing a book and actually getting it published and in the world physically as an object is, you know, 9 times out of 10 for writers of colour is through sheer force of will. So to have a book that kind of penetrates through the massive books that are published every year, I mean, you know, just the number is just madly depressing, and you know, to penetrate through that and to have some kind of presence within the culture, in the sense that it might have, you know, some kind of longevity within the culture beyond the publishing cycle, is completely amazing. So yeah, it's the ultimate, for me, it's kind of the ultimate compliment. The idea, you know, my preoccupation is just to keep writing novels and to create a body of work, and the idea that some of those novels will find their way within a canon that might be remembered, whether it's a year or 5 years or even longer than that, is massively flattering, and it's, you know, it's what you really wish for as a writer.
What about you, Paul? Do you feel the same way?
Yeah, absolutely. Not going to turn down the opportunity to be part of the canon. And yeah, I mean, like Audre Lorde says about, you know, doing your work. Like, you know, representation is important. And every new generation needs to learn, apparently, afresh Black history, especially Black British history, queer people of color history, because it just gets swept under the carpet and forgotten every generation. So there is always a responsibility to represent, but also, like we've already said, we're not a monolith. There are so many sort of intersections at which each of us writes as queer people of color, because we all come from different places. We're all, like the Vogue houses in your book, Niven, we all come from different walks of life to find our chosen families. We all have a different story to tell. We've all come from families that have toughed us out, etc., etc. and so we all deserve the opportunity to have a voice. And I just really hope that young people of color, young queer people of color, young queer people of all backgrounds, young people of all backgrounds can look at my book, look at Niven's book, and see something of themselves. And even if they have to live a life that doesn't sort of absolutely go to plan, they know that they can use writing as a way to, to explain things to themselves, to examine their creativity, and to be able to tell a story, because we need to hear those stories. You know, people say that the novel is dead. No, it's not.
It ain't dead.
No, it's not.
It ain't dead.
It was an old white guy who said the novel was dead.
And I've been saying that since
and that's because he wanted to go off and write a wine book instead.
Right, exactly.
They said that like since day, and then Proust came along and, you know, showed the novel.
I don't think the novel's ever going to die. We love stories too much,
Exactly.
you know?
Yeah, we really love stories too much.
Yeah.
And there's certain stories and certain intersections that can only really be examined in the space that a novel provides, because it's about characters. It's about, you know, we all live lives. None of us lives in a box to ourselves, even though it might resemble one at the moment. But we're all part of, we're all part of a big wide world. We're all part of something much bigger than ourselves. We're all having conversations all over the world. So there are just innumerable opportunities to write about different relationships and different intersections. And yeah, I'm just looking forward to seeing more interesting and amazing, unique stories coming through.
I think that is a really beautiful note to end on, actually. So guys, I'm going to read the outro, but before I do, I just want to say huge thank you to both of you. And like I said, actually, before cameras started rolling, I've spent the last 2 days, because I stepped in at the last minute to chair this event, I just spent the last 2 days immersed in both of your novels. And I feel like I'm leaving to go back to hang out with Teddy and Jessie and like everyone. It's really exciting to me that the two worlds, they haven't merged because they're so different, but I feel like my brain is populated by your creations, and it's like, it's a privilege actually to hang out with them.
Thank you.
So
Thanks so much.
I'm going to read this outro text now, so everyone sit tight. Thank you so much to Niven Govinden and Paul Mendez, and to all of you at home for joining BookBound 2020 for this event. There are lots of great events like this on our programme. Search for BookBound2020 on Twitter and Instagram to learn more, and help us spread the word using the hashtag BookBound2020. If you'd like to buy the work of either of our authors tonight, which you absolutely should, the links in the text below this video will take you through to Hive, an online bookseller which supports independent bookshops. Links to books discussed here and a discount code on selected festival titles are below. You will also find our authors' favourite independent bookshops across the globe. We endorse fully always supporting your independent bookshops and not the other kind, which actually I should also say, this was an event that was slated to be in the wonderful bookshop Pages of Hackney and had to go online because of Miss Corona. So you should go and check out Pages. They have a phenomenal lineup of events coming up.
We love Pages.
Yeah, they're the best. When we're all allowed to be in the same room as one another again.
Well, I'm sure we'll reprise this event, won't we, Niven?
Yeah, we should.
Yeah,
that would be
totally
really fun.
will.
Yeah, that would be amazing.
Fantastic.
You can also find the Just Giving link to donate to Mind below. Please give generously. The goal now is to double our the target. So if you can donate whatever you can spare at the moment, be it 5p or 50 quid. I mean, 50 quid might be a bit much, but you know what I'm saying. Please give generously and help us support Mind. And that's it. So wishing you all a good night and a good weekend. And thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Bye, everyone.
See ya.
Bye,
See ya. Bye.
Keep waving, they say.